Hi, I'm Jake Parker, and I'm going to be talking to you all about the constitutional rights within disaster policy. So I wanted to start things off by just giving a brief summary of what the Constitution actually was and why it's important in disaster situations. And it can be broken down simply to as the supreme law of the land in the states. And it was signed by our founding fathers in Philadelphia, September 17th, 1787, and it was signed by 39 of the 55 delegates. Basically, it outlines the important limitations that the government has to protect the citizens' rights. And it's important for emergency managers to uphold the Constitution so the victims can feel a sense of stability in a potentially chaotic time. And I also wanted to point out the preamble to the Constitution, and I think an important aspect of this is the first three words to the preamble, which is "we the people." And I think this points out pretty importantly that as citizens, we can't solely depend on the government to take care of us, and it's our responsibility and duty to uphold the Constitution as well. And the highlighted bit I have here is to ensure domestic tranquility, to provide for the common defense, and to promote the general welfare. And so I think that kind of comes down to a team effort, essentially, to help one another. And it's our duty to uphold the Constitution as well and not violate others' rights. So the majority of the amendments I'm going to be focusing on are in the first 10 amendments, which is the Bill of Rights, which was written by James Madison. And the Bill of Rights was created because states felt there was a need for greater constitutional protection. And so getting into that further, the amendments I'm going to be looking at today are the First Amendment, the Second Amendment, the Fourth Amendment, the Sixth, and the 14th. So, kind of a brief overview of these. The First Amendment is freedom of religion, speech, and freedom of the press. The Second Amendment is the right to bear arms. The Fourth Amendment is protection from unreasonable search and seizure. The Sixth Amendment is the right of accused persons in criminal case, and that covers the right to a fair and speedy trial. And the 14th Amendment is the rights of citizenship. So the images I've chosen here, the bottom left shows victims in suffering Hurricane Katrina, and the far right image is a man who's being held in a Japanese internment camp, and the top left image is, I believe, a SWAT team that is entering a house after the Boston bombing. And so I chose these images because, firstly, the far right image, this man is being held unlawfully in an internment camp, and this happened after the attack on Pearl Harbor, and this was a violation of the 14th Amendment. And this man is having his citizens' rights violated. He should have equal protection under the law. And the bottom left picture in Katrina was essentially a pretty good case study of how to not respond in a disaster situation. And there were quite a few amendment rights that were violated in this disaster. The first is the First Amendment, and there were counts of FEMA trying to silence the press by restricting them from entering certain areas, and they did this in an effort to control what material was being released to the public. They felt that the images were too graphic, and they didn't want to spread more fear than there already was going around. But it's the press's right to release these images to the public. Another amendment right that was violated is the Second Amendment and the Fourth Amendment. Police were unlawfully searching and seizing weapons from citizens, and they did this regardless of whether or not these weapons were lawfully owned or not. And they were doing this because there were reports of armed gangs going around and causing trouble. So they may have disarmed some of these gangs, but they also took the only form of self-defense from a lot of these people in a relatively lawless time. And the image of the SWAT team during the Boston bombing, there were reports that police and SWAT teams were forcing families out of their homes, and they did this to try and find the final Tsarnaev brother. And they were forcing these families out of their homes and searching the homes without a warrant. So that was another violation of the Fourth Amendment, which is unlawful search and seizure. And I mentioned earlier that the Sixth Amendment is a potential right to be violated, and that is the right to a fair and speedy trial. And basically law has to go on, and you can't be held over a long extended period of time just because there's a natural disaster. So that has to carry on as well. Some other legal implications I felt were important to mention is the Insurrection Act of 1807. And this is a set of laws which provides the president the ability to deploy troops in the U.S. once all local and state resources have been exhausted. And also the Posse Comitatus Act, and this kind of partners with that, and it limits the power of the president and federal government in using federal military personnel to enforce state laws. Martial law is generally something we don't want to experience. It's been declared 11 times, I believe, in the states. And this can be declared after there's a breakdown of civil authority, and the military can be called in to enforce laws and restore order. This is obviously a scary time for citizens, and the picture I have chosen here is a artist's representation of the Great Chicago Fire, and martial law was declared during this disaster. However, with all this gloom and doom going on, there is progress being made, and the IASC Interagency Standing Committee, they made it, released an operational guideline, which is essentially 90 pages of how human rights can be protected in natural disasters. And also the American Bar Association recently formed a committee on disaster response and preparedness. Thank you for listening, and I'm looking forward to your responses.